no fortress looms larger in the imagination than Angband, the Iron Prison. For over 6 centuries of the First Age, this subterranean nightmare served as the seat of ultimate evil, the stronghold from which Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, waged war against the light of creation itself. Yet, for all its infamy, the true nature of what lay within those black halls remains shrouded in shadow and terror. Tonight, we descend into the deepest places of Middle-earth, beyond the reach of sun or star, to explore the most infamous fortress in all of Tolkien's legendarium. We uncover its origins as an outlying bastion to its transformation into the capital of darkness, from its labyrinthine chambers to its deepest pits. This is the complete story of what lay inside the Iron Prison, and why its influence reached far beyond its destruction into the very foundations of Middle-earth itself. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Fear. Angband was a mighty fortified citadel, originally constructed by Melkor in the earliest days of the world as an outlying fortress to his northern stronghold of Utumno. To understand what lay within its black depths, we must first comprehend why it was built, and how it came to eclipse even its greater predecessor in infamy. In the years of the lamps, when the world was young and the Valar had lit the 2 lamps to illuminate all of Arda, Melkor had already begun his corruption of creation. From his primary stronghold of Utumno in the uttermost north, he cast his shadow across the world, but even in his malice he understood the principles of strategic defense. Melkor built Angband during this period, originally as an outlying fortress and armory to his great northern citadel at Utumno. It was built beneath the Iron Mountains north of Beleriand as a first defense against any attack on Melkor's realm. The location was chosen wisely. Positioned in the Iron Mountains in the far north, Angband could serve as both an advanced warning system and a staging ground for operations against any force that might emerge from Aman to challenge Morgoth's dominion. More importantly, it controlled access to the broader continent of Middle-earth, ensuring that no power could approach Utumno without first contending with this fortress. Melkor originally built Angband to guard against a possible attack from Aman by the Valar, and placed it under the command of Sauron. This appointment reveals much about both the fortress's importance and Sauron's early rise to prominence among the fallen Maiar. Even then, before he would become the Lord of the Rings, Sauron was recognized as Melkor's most capable lieutenant, trusted to command the Dark Lord's most strategically vital outpost. So what was Sauron's Angband like in these early days? We can only speculate, but it would have been a place of military precision and malevolent efficiency. Sauron, with his love of order and control, would have organized the fortress along rational lines: supply chains for the armies of darkness, workshops for the creation of weapons and armor, and most crucially, chambers for the breeding and mustering of the creatures that would become the backbone of Morgoth's forces. The fortress in this period likely served as a center for the expansion of corruption that had already begun at Utumno. While the first experiments in the transformation of captured elves into orcs had taken place at Melkor's primary stronghold, Angband may have become a secondary site for this work, refining the techniques developed at Utumno and establishing the breeding populations that would later supply Morgoth's armies. At the initiation of the Battle of the Powers, the assault of the Valar breached Angband's defences, and they swiftly moved on to Melkor's primary stronghold of Utumno. When the Valar finally stirred themselves to war against Melkor for the sake of the newly awakened elves, Angband's outer defences fell to their assault. Yet this apparent victory carried the seeds of future decay. Angband's underground vaults and caverns were left relatively intact after the Valar's onslaught, as they were in great haste to capture Melkor for the sake of keeping the newly awakened elves safe. The Valar, in their urgency to reach Utumno and capture Melkor before he could threaten the elves further, did not take the time to fully explore and cleanse the depths of Angband. This would prove to be a decision with consequences that would echo through the ages. After Melkor's defeat at Utumno, the Balrogs came to Angband to lay in hiding within its ruined foundations. In the abandoned depths, creatures of shadow and flame found refuge. The demons of terror, the Valar Aukar, retreated to the deepest pits and waited. With them came other servants of darkness, orcs, wolves, and creatures whose names have been lost to history. Angband became a refuge for evil, a seed of future destruction lying dormant beneath the earth. Chapter 2. the Reconstruction of Nightmare. For 3 ages of the Valar, Melkor remained imprisoned in the halls of Mandos, while his abandoned fortresses stood empty and his servants slumbered in the dark. But imprisonment, even by the Valar, could not change the fundamental nature of the first and mightiest of the Ainur. When Melkor was finally released, his thoughts turned immediately to the resumption of his war against the light. After 3 ages, Melkor was released, destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor, stole the Silmarils, and escaped from Aman. After fleeing, Melkor, now named Morgoth by his enemies, returned to Middle-earth and redelved the ruins of Angband, raising the volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim over it. The choice to rebuild Angband rather than Utumno was strategic. The southern fortress was closer to the lands where the Noldor would make their new kingdoms, and its position offered advantages for the campaigns to come. But the new Angband would be far more than a mere restoration of the old fortress. These peaks were created from the slag and rubble caused by the redelving of the fortress, and as such, it is likely that the rebuilt Angband extended for a considerably greater distance underground than its original incarnation. The 3 volcanic mountains of Thangorodrim were not merely defensive works. They were monuments to evil itself, towering volcanic peaks visible from vast distances and serving as a constant reminder of Morgoth's presence. What emerged from this reconstruction was perhaps the most sophisticated fortress ever built for the purposes of waging war against the light itself. Angband was a primarily subterranean stronghold under the towering volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim, among the greatest mountains seen in Middle-earth. Before the Great Gate, there was a somber court area flanked by frightening cliffs and walled by the towers of a great battlement. Every aspect of Angband's construction likely served the dual purpose of maximizing its military effectiveness, while simultaneously crushing the spirits of those who encountered it. This was architecture as psychological warfare, using the very environment to inspire despair and communicate the inevitability of Morgoth's victory. The approach to Angband was designed to inspire despair in any who saw it. The courtyard before the Great Gate was deliberately somber and oppressive, surrounded by cliffs that seemed to leer down at any who entered. The battlement towers were not merely functional but psychological weapons, their very presence a declaration that this was a place from which no enemy would emerge alive. Through the gate, there was a long, great tunnel leading to what might be described as a labyrinthine pyramid of stairs, corridors, tunnels, and smithy chambers. Once past the Great Gate, visitors found themselves in a deliberately confusing maze. This was not accidental. The labyrinthine design served multiple purposes. It prevented enemies from easily navigating the fortress, it allowed defenders to channel attackers into kill zones, and it created a psychological effect of being trapped within an endless nightmare. This design suggests a 3-dimensional maze that extended both horizontally and vertically through the mountain. Stairs led to corridors that led to more stairs, creating a sense of endless ascent and descent. For those forced to navigate these passages, whether invading enemies or unfortunate prisoners, the experience would have been one of mounting psychological terror. The scale of the fortress was equally important as a psychological weapon. The enormous chambers, the vast workshops, the seemingly endless passages, all of these served to communicate the immense power and resources at Morgoth's disposal. No individual, no matter how heroic, could stand against a power capable of creating and maintaining such a vast infrastructure of evil. Vents and chasms belched smoke and flame from Morgoth's gigantic blast furnaces, and smithies up through the mountain to the peaks of Thangorodrim. The rebuilt Angband was not merely a fortress, but an industrial complex devoted to the production of war material on an unprecedented scale. The smithies and blast furnaces were described as gigantic, suggesting production capabilities that dwarfed anything in the kingdoms of the Free Peoples. These workshops would have been scenes of hellish activity, orcs and other servants of darkness labouring endlessly to produce weapons, armour, and the implements of war. The heat from the forges would have made the air shimmer with distortion, while the constant hammering of metal would have created a din that echoed through the mountain. The vent system that carried smoke and heat up through Thangorodrim would have made the peaks appear as constantly active volcanoes, belching forth the exhalations of industry and malice. But what was being produced in these chambers went beyond mere weapons. This was where the arms and armour of the Balrogs were forged, where the chains that bound captives were made, and where the great engines of war that would terrorise Beleriand were constructed. The scale of production suggests a workforce numbered in the tens of thousands, all labouring under the whips of overseers to fuel Morgoth's war machine. From his dark throne in the nethermost hall, Morgoth directed the war against the Yoldor who had returned from the west, and all the free peoples that supported them in Beleriand. At the heart of this vast complex lay the throne room of Morgoth himself, the nethermost hall that served as the nerve centre of his empire of darkness. The throne room was positioned at the deepest accessible level of the fortress, both for security and for symbolic reasons. Here, in a hall that never knew the light of sun or star, Morgoth held court and planned the wars that would devastate Beleriand. The very description, nethermost hall, suggests a place so deep within the earth that it seemed to exist in another realm entirely. We can imagine this hall as a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow despite the fires that burned eternally around its perimeter. The throne itself would have been carved from black stone or forged from dark iron, designed not for comfort but to inspire awe and terror in any who approached it. From this seat, Morgoth could survey maps of his campaigns, receive reports from his captains, and issue the orders that would send armies of darkness across the face of Middle-earth. Chapter 3. The Chambers of Torment. There were also many tunnels leading to the slave quarters or vaults. Among the most horrific aspects of Angband were the extensive facilities dedicated to housing the countless prisoners taken during Morgoth's wars. These were not mere dungeons, but an entire infrastructure devoted to the systematic breaking of captured enemies. The slave quarters would have been a vast network of cells, barracks, and holding areas carved deep into the rock. Here, elves captured in battle would have been brought to face a fate worse than death, continuation of the transformation processes that had been pioneered at Utumno. The fortress served as a centre for the breeding and management of orc populations that had been established through techniques first developed at Morgoth's primary stronghold. These chambers would have echoed constantly with the sounds of despair, the cries of the newly captured, the moans of those undergoing torment, and the bitter laughter of those who had already fallen to darkness. The very air would have been thick with the stench of fear and suffering, creating an atmosphere so oppressive that even hardened warriors would have found their courage failing. But the slave quarters served purposes beyond mere cruelty. They were also laboratories where Morgoth's servants studied the nature of the children of Ilúvatar, seeking to understand their weaknesses and find new ways to corrupt them. The knowledge gained in these hellish chambers would influence the Dark Lord's strategies throughout the long war that followed. Perhaps even more disturbing than the slave quarters were the areas where Morgoth's servants bred and multiplied the armies of darkness. The orc populations established through techniques first developed at Utumno were expanded and managed in chambers deliberately kept in perpetual darkness. In these breeding chambers, orcs would have mated and raised their young in conditions that ensured their loyalty to Morgoth. These offspring, born in captivity and knowing no other existence, would have been shaped from birth to serve darkness. The psychological conditioning would have been as important as the physical environment, creating creatures whose very nature was antithetical to the beauty and light of creation. The breeding chambers would also have housed other creatures, wolves, bats, and the various lesser monsters that served as scouts and shock troops in Morgoth's armies. The careful management of these populations would have required extensive knowledge of their life cycles and needs, suggesting that Angband contained scholars of darkness as well as warriors. Beyond the great industrial smithies lay smaller, more specialised workshops, where the most terrible weapons of Morgoth's war were created. These forges were not merely places of metalwork, but laboratories where the very nature of creation was perverted to serve evil ends. Here, the weapons of the Balrogs would have been crafted, whips of fire that could cut through armour as easily as flesh, and blades that burned within a flame. The work done in these chambers went beyond ordinary smithcraft. It involved the binding of malevolent spirits into metal, the creation of weapons that were themselves alive with malice. The most skilled among Morgoth's servants would have laboured here, Maiar fallen to darkness, who retained their knowledge of creation but turned it to destructive ends. The techniques developed in these forges would later influence Sauron's own work, though his mastery of ring lore would draw primarily upon his original Orlean heritage and later studies in Eregion. Chapter 4. The Deepest Darkness. There were also mines within Angband that extended deeper than Morgoth's throne room. Beneath even the nethermost hall where Morgoth held court lay deeper levels that served purposes so dark that they were known only to the Dark Lord himself and his most trusted servants. These mines were not dug for precious metals or gems, but for darker purposes. Some may have been attempts to dig ever deeper into the foundations of the world itself, seeking to reach the roots of creation and corrupt them at their source. Others may have been burial chambers for secrets too terrible to be kept in the upper levels, artifacts of power too dangerous even for Morgoth to use, or experiments that had gone so wrong that they had to be sealed away. The deepest mines may also have served as prisons for creatures that were too powerful to be destroyed, but too dangerous to be allowed freedom. Here, in chambers carved so deep that they existed below the level of all natural caves and water sources, Morgoth may have imprisoned beings whose very existence threatened the stability of his realm. After Melkor's defeat at Utumno, the Balrogs came to Angband and lay in hiding within its ruined foundations. When Melkor, now named Morgoth, fled Valinor with Ungoliant, he came to Lammoth near the ruins of Angband to renew his rule in Middle-earth. A disagreement with Ungoliant led to her attacking him, and Morgoth gave out a great cry that roused the Balrogs from their concealment. The fact that Morgoth's cry could reach the Balrogs in the depths of Angband and rouse them from their long hiding tells us much about both the acoustic properties of the fortress and the nature of the chambers where these demons dwelt. The Balrog warrens must have been among the deepest accessible chambers in all of Angband, deep enough that the creatures could remain hidden undisturbed for ages, yet connected enough to the surface that their master's call could reach them. These chambers would have been vast spaces, capable of housing multiple Balrogs in comfort, with high ceilings to accommodate beings of their stature and power. The environment would likely have been kept deliberately hot and dry, with perhaps natural sources of volcanic heat from the mountains above. The Balrogs, being creatures of fire and shadow, would have required an environment that supported their elemental nature. It's speculative but possible that the deepest levels of Angband may have encountered tunnel networks that predated even Melkor's arrival in Arda. Far, far below the deepest delving of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he. These nameless things, which Gandalf encountered in the depths beneath Moria, existed in tunnel systems that had been gnawed from the foundations of the world since its earliest days. It's conceivable that Morgoth, in his deep excavations beneath Angband, encountered these primordial passages and perhaps even made contact with the ancient entities that dwelt there. If such contact occurred, it might explain some of the more inexplicable horrors that emerged from Angband during the Wars of Beleriand. Creatures that seemed to belong to no known category of being, monsters whose very presence seemed to weaken the fabric of reality itself. These may have been the result of Morgoth's alliance with or corruption of beings that predated the creation of the world as the Valar knew it. The tunnels created by the nameless things that gnawed at the world's foundations appear to have formed a web of passages connecting various parts of Middle-earth. When the orcs of the Misty Mountains dug around Goblin Town, delving new tunnels and expanding and joining those that already existed, their original owners withdrew to the deepest depths and lurked beyond their knowledge. This pattern of existing tunnel systems being expanded and connected by later inhabitants may have applied to Angband as well. If Angband's builders discovered and expanded upon these primordial passages, it would explain the seemingly impossible scale of the fortress's underground complex. Even with thousands of workers labouring for years, the excavation of such a vast fortress would have been a monumental undertaking. But if Morgoth's servants were adapting and expanding existing tunnel networks, the work would have been far more manageable. Gandalf speaks of nameless things in the deeps and describes his long pursuit. This suggests a vast underworld of passages the Balrog could have used. If Durin's Bane could use these tunnels to navigate beneath Moria, it raises the intriguing possibility that the Balrog's original arrival there was not through surface travel, but through this underground network. When Angband was destroyed at the end of the First Age, the surviving Balrog may have escaped not by fleeing across the surface, but by retreating deep into the tunnel systems that connected Angband to other parts of Middle-earth. The journey from the ruins of Angband to the roots of the Misty Mountains would have been an epic underground odyssey, lasting perhaps decades or centuries. Through passages carved by entities older than Sauron himself, the last of the Balrogs may have travelled beneath Middle-earth, following routes that bypassed all surface obstacles and knowledge. This possibility raises an intriguing question about Gandalf's reluctance to enter Moria during the Fellowship's journey. As one of the Astari, Gandalf may have possessed knowledge about the true extent of the underground networks and their connections to the former sites of Morgoth's power. His reluctance to enter Moria may have stemmed not just from knowledge of the Balrog's presence, but from understanding that the ancient fortress connected to tunnel systems that led back to places of primordial darkness. Chapter 5. The War Years. During the centuries of warfare that followed the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, Angband functioned as the nerve centre of a war effort that spanned an entire continent. From his dark throne in the nethermost hall, Morgoth directed the war against the Noldor who had returned from the west, and all the free peoples that supported them in Beleriand. The command structure required to coordinate such a vast war effort would likely have been staggeringly complex. Information had to flow from scouts and spies across Beleriand back to Angband, where it could be analysed and used to plan countermoves. Orders had to be transmitted to field commanders leading armies hundreds of miles away. Supply lines had to be maintained to keep those armies fed, armed and equipped for battle. The halls of Angband would probably have bustled with constant activity, messengers arriving with reports from the front lines, scribes recording and analysing intelligence, and generals planning the next phase of operations. Map rooms would have been essential, with detailed charts of Beleriand showing the positions of enemy forces, the locations of supply depots, and the routes available for moving armies. Among the most fearsome weapons developed during Morgoth's later war effort were the dragons, and Angband must have contained facilities for housing these terrible creatures. The dragons were not merely wild beasts, but intelligent beings capable of speech and cunning. Their accommodation would have required chambers of enormous size and sophisticated design. The dragon chambers would likely have been among the largest single spaces in all of Angband, with ceilings high enough to accommodate creatures like Glaurung and eventually Ankalagan the Black. These chambers would have required their own ventilation systems to handle the heat and gases produced by the dragons, as well as reinforced walls capable of containing creatures of immense physical power. The development of dragons represented one of Morgoth's most closely guarded projects, likely conducted in the deepest and most secure parts of the fortress. The knowledge required to create and manage such creatures would have been among the most valuable possessed by Morgoth's servants. The weapons and armour produced in Angband's forges had to be stored somewhere, and the scale of Morgoth's armies suggests armories of almost unimaginable size. Weapons for hundreds of thousands of orcs, specialised equipment for Balrogs and dragons, siege engines for attacking fortified positions. All of this material had to be organised, maintained and deployed as needed. The main armories would likely have been vast underground warehouses, with weapons arranged by type and quality. Separate sections would probably have housed equipment for different types of troops. Basic swords and shields for ordinary orcs, more sophisticated weapons for elite units, and the specialised implements used by creatures like trolls and balrogs. For over 4 centuries, the Siege of Angband represented the height of elvish power and hope in Beleriand. The combined forces of the Noldor had succeeded in containing Morgoth within his fortress, seemingly on the verge of ultimate victory. Yet within Angband's depths, the Dark Lord was preparing for a counterstroke that would shatter his enemies and reverse the course of the war. The breaking of the siege came with the Dagor Bragollach, when Morgoth unleashed Glaurung and armies of such size that the elves had never conceived of their like. During the siege years, the fortress would have been operating at maximum capacity, with every forge working constantly to produce weapons and armour for the armies that would eventually break the siege. Chapter 6. The Final Days. When the final assault came, led by the host of the Valar, with Eärendil flying overhead in his ship Vingiloch, Angband faced enemies more powerful than any it had ever encountered. The fortress that had withstood the siege of the Noldor for centuries was not designed to resist the combined might of the Valar themselves. The War of Wrath was so damaging that it sunk Beleriand, including the remains of Angband and Utumno. The destruction was so complete that it reshaped the geography of northwestern Middle-earth permanently. The final days would have seen the emptying of the dragon chambers as every worm capable of flight was launched against the host of the Valar. The armories would have been stripped bare as weapons were distributed to every creature capable of bearing them. Slaves emerging from Angband were amazed to see how much the world had changed since their imprisonment, as the sheer scope of the war had caused so much destruction that the entire landscape was altered. The liberation of prisoners from Angband's depths revealed the true scale of suffering that had taken place within the fortress over the centuries of its operation. But not everyone who emerged from the ruins was a former prisoner seeking freedom. Some servants of Morgoth, faced with the destruction of their world, would not have passively accepted defeat. The tunnel networks that may have connected Angband to other parts of Middle-earth could have provided escape routes for those who knew of their existence. Dragons endured into later ages, as evidenced by the drakes found in the withered heath and other remote places, though we don't know which specific individuals escaped the destruction. If creatures as large as dragons could survive the final catastrophe, it's conceivable that other servants of darkness might have fled through the deep tunnels that connected Angband to the underground networks of Middle-earth. Chapter 7. Legacy of the Iron Prison. The deepest levels of Angband had housed creatures and servants whose loyalty to Morgoth went beyond mere coercion. These beings, faced with the destruction of their world, would not have passively accepted defeat. Some may have fought to the bitter end, but others would have sought escape through whatever means remained available. The tunnel networks that may have connected Angband to other parts of Middle-earth would have provided escape routes for those who knew of their existence. Servants of Morgoth familiar with the deepest levels of the fortress might have been able to flee through passages that led far from the destruction above. These survivors, carrying with them knowledge of Angband's darkest secrets, would have dispersed throughout Middle-earth to await the return of their master or his successor. The thought that former inhabitants of Angband might have survived the War of Wrath and taken refuge in places like the tunnels beneath Moria adds a darker dimension to encounters with ancient evils in later ages. When the dwarves of Khazad-dûm delved too deep and awoke Durin's bane, were they merely disturbing a Balrog that had found refuge there by chance, or were they uncovering a survivor of Angband who had deliberately sought out the deep places connected to his former home? Though Angband itself was destroyed so completely that its very location was submerged beneath the waves, the influence of what had transpired within its chambers continued to shape the history of Middle-earth for thousands of years. The organizational methods developed there, the industrial techniques perfected in its smithies, and the knowledge gained through its fell experiments all survived in various forms. Sauron, who had commanded Angband in its earliest days, carried with him the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent in the fortress's depths. When he began the construction of Barad-dûr in the Second Age, he likely drew upon this experience to create a stronghold that, while different in purpose, reflected many of the same principles that had made Angband so formidable. The breeding of orcs, techniques that had been refined in Angband's chambers, continued throughout the Second and Third Ages in various locations across Middle-earth. The methods of organization and military production developed in the fortress's workshops were applied again and again by Sauron's servants. Even the Uruk-hai, created by Saruman in the Third Age, represented an evolution of methods that had been perfected in the depths of the Iron Prison. Among the most dangerous legacies of Angband was the organizational and military knowledge that had been accumulated within its walls over the millennia of its operation. This was not merely technological knowledge, but deeper understanding of how to coordinate vast evil enterprises and maintain them over centuries. Sauron's later mastery of large-scale organization and industrial production suggests that he had learned invaluable lessons from his time commanding Angband. When he built his war machine in the Second and Third Ages, he was drawing upon centuries of experience in managing vast fortresses and coordinating military campaigns on a continental scale. Chapter 8. The Unseen Connections. The nameless things themselves represent perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the underground networks. These entities, older than Sauron and unknown even to him, existed in the deepest places and appeared to be actively gnawing at the foundations of the world. Their purpose and nature remain completely mysterious, but their persistence suggests a kind of primordial corruption that predates even Melkor's rebellion. The description of these beings as gnawing at the world's foundations suggests ongoing activity rather than dormant presence. This implies that the tunnel networks were not static structures, but continuously changing systems, expanding and shifting as the nameless things pursued their incomprehensible goals. The fact that even Gandalf refused to describe what he had seen in the deepest places suggests horrors beyond normal understanding. These were not merely dangerous creatures, but entities whose very existence challenged the fundamental nature of reality as the Free Peoples understood it. Chapter 9. The Final Mystery. Despite all that we know about Angband's structure and function, the deepest levels of the fortress remain shrouded in mystery. Tolkien's texts provide tantalizing hints about chambers and passages that extended far below even Morgoth's throne room, but the specific contents of these areas are left to speculation. It's possible that these deepest chambers housed experiments too dangerous or too important to be conducted elsewhere. Research into the fundamental nature of creation, attempts to contact or communicate with powers beyond Arda, or the development of weapons that could threaten the Valar themselves might have required the most secure and isolated facilities available. The deepest levels might also have served as repositories for knowledge that Morgoth considered too dangerous to share, even with his most trusted servants. Ancient texts from before the creation of Arda, records of conversations with Eru Ilúvatar during the music of the Ainur, or detailed analyses of the weaknesses of the other Valar could have been stored in chambers that only Morgoth himself could access. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that the deepest chambers housed entities or artifacts that were not under Morgoth's control, things so ancient or so powerful that even the Dark Lord could only contain rather than command them, resources that he saved for the most desperate circumstances, or allies whose price for assistance was too high to pay except in the final extremity. The destruction of Angband removed from the world not just a fortress, but a repository of knowledge about the darkest aspects of organized evil. The techniques developed there, the secrets discovered in its laboratories, and the wisdom accumulated over millennia of existence all vanished beneath the waves at the end of the First Age. What might Middle-earth's history have been like if that knowledge had survived intact? Would Sauron have been able to accomplish even more with complete access to Angband's accumulated wisdom? Could the techniques developed there have been turned to benevolent purposes by those who opposed evil? The tunnel networks that may have connected Angband to other parts of Middle-earth raise equally intriguing questions. If such passages still existed in later ages, what other secrets might they have contained? Were there other installations connected to Angband that survived its destruction? Could there have been evacuation procedures that allowed more of Morgoth's knowledge and resources to escape than anyone realized? The nameless things that gnawed at the world's foundations represent perhaps the greatest mystery of all. If Morgoth did make contact with these entities, what might he have learned from them? What bargains might he have made, and what prices might still be owed? Could these creatures have influenced Angband's development in ways that no one suspected? As we emerge from our exploration of Angband's darkest depths, we carry with us both knowledge and warning. The Iron Prison stands as perhaps the most complete example in Tolkien's works of how power, knowledge, and organized effort can be turned to serve ultimate evil. Every chamber we have explored, every passage we have traversed, reminds us that the capacity for such systematic corruption exists within the very fabric of creation. Yet our journey also reveals something equally important, that even the mightiest fortress of evil could not stand forever against the forces of light. Angband fell not to the armies of its enemies, but to the direct intervention of powers greater than any earthly force. This reminds us that no matter how complete evil's victory might appear, there are always greater powers at work in the world. The suggestion that Angband may have been connected to ancient tunnel networks that still exist beneath Middle-earth adds a darker dimension to our understanding. Perhaps the fortress's destruction was not as complete as it appeared. Perhaps some of its influence, some of its knowledge, some of its servants survived in the deep places where nameless things gnaw at the foundations of the world. When Gandalf refused to describe what he had seen in those deepest places, he was protecting more than just the peace of mind of his companions. He was acknowledging that some knowledge is too dangerous to share, that some truths about the nature of evil are too corrosive to bear. Yet he also walked those passages and emerged from them, proving that even the darkest places can be traversed by those who carry light within themselves. The story of Angband is ultimately a story about choices. The choices that create evil, the choices that serve it, and the choices that ultimately destroy it. Every individual who entered its gates faced the fundamental decision between light and darkness, between service to creation and service to destruction. The fortress succeeded because too many chose darkness, and it fell because enough chose light. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive tonight. Until next time, stay safe and stay by the fire.